Hello, my name is Michaela. Welcome to 15 Minutes with Paul Ward, where Paul answers common questions he has gotten in his 20 years as a real estate agent in Ventura County. This week's topic is very timely and at the top of a lot of people's minds, and that is seller concessions. But first, let's thank the sponsors that make 15 Minutes with Paul Ward possible.
Yes, thank you, Michaela. We have to thank our sponsors, of course, the Escrow Hub and the Money Store. So thank you so much, sponsors. And I'm excited to discuss this topic with you.
Great. So let's get super basic. In a nutshell, what are seller concessions?
Sure. I describe a seller concession as anything a seller gives to a buyer to seal the deal, to make the deal happen. Of course, the number one item that folks negotiate on any transaction is price. That's always number one. But there are other items that come into play to, make that transaction go through. And so kind of overall, all-encompassing term for that is concessions. And this can happen up front when the offer is first presented to a seller, or it could happen after price has already been negotiated and there's a little bit of a gap between what the seller is seeking and what the buyer is offering. And so in addition to, of course, the price, there are other items that can be negotiated, and these are, overall considered concessions.
What are the three categories of concessions?
Sure. I put concessions into three categories. The big one, of course, is, you could probably guess, is money.
Yep.
Okay. Money is number one. Number two, I would say, are repairs. Okay. Of course, money also comes into play because repairs have costs, but those would be costs that the seller incurs, something that the buyer really wants repaired. We can talk about that. Mm-hmm. And the third category, which would be further down the line, would be the all-encompassing stuff, would be personal property that would not be real property attached to the land, but would be personal property owned by the seller that they could take with them that the buyer really, really wants. And sometimes, emotions run high and that transaction comes down to a piece of personal property that had nothing to do with the real estate. But, it's a concession to seal the deal, so to speak.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's interesting. I can't wait for some examples later on.
Sure.
What are the benefits of seller concessions, and why would the seller even want to pay towards the buyer's pest inspection?
Sure. So pest inspection is I would put in the category of repair.
Okay.
So pest inspection, which was kind of termite, all encompassing. We say termite, but so pest inspection / termite repair is actually required for some types of loans. VA and FHA loans typically require a termite clearance. It was and still is very common for a seller to provide a buyer with a termite clearance, but it's actually not required for most transactions. So it's still customary that a seller cover that cost, but it's not required. So sometimes, it's left out of the contract. And sometimes a seller will give the buyer a credit for those repairs in lieu of actually doing the work. So there's different ways that we can approach that particular repair item. There are other repairs that would be considered concessions as well. One out in the country, selling, lots of country properties, mm-hmm. We have a lot of properties have septic tanks. They're not connected to the sewer system. So right. Having the sewer system inspected during escrow or even before you list the property is actually the best way to do that. and then taking care of any repairs or even replacement of the system if it's dysfunctional. That would be a seller concession that would be offered to the buyer. And not to get too graphic, but the buyer doesn't want to pay for the seller's poop. Yeah, so you can replace that word, but that's a big one. If you don't have a sewer system and you're attached to a septic system, typically the seller will be on the hook for at least an inspection, but more often than not, that would be an item that they would repair or replace if it's called for. There are all kinds of other repairs. So a buyer is going to do a home inspection.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes a seller will do a pre-listing inspection, and just because they want to get a heads up on what's wrong with their home. There's a little window when a buyer might know even more than the seller because the buyer's paid for this home inspection report. And then all of a sudden, the price has already been negotiated, property's already in escrow, and the buyer drops this big report to the seller and says, here's a 50-page report with all kinds of pictures, and I want 25 of these items, fixed or replaced. And so the seller is kind of like a deer in the headlights. They've already negotiated the price, and now all of a sudden the buyer is asking for so much more. So that's kind of a second round of negotiation. And there are, certain tricks of the trade to deal with that situation if you're, working with the seller. But you also have to, keep both parties happy to keep the transaction going. Sometimes those requests are very unreasonable. And so you have to, also guide your client that way. But any repairs would also be considered or credit in lieu of repairs would be considered a concession that the seller would give to the buyer.
What are concessions like now compared to maybe just 2 years ago?
Sure. So it's kind of flipped on its head, right? So COVID was very interesting here in Ventura County. I say it was the perfect storm. So Los Angeles County has about 10 million people. California, if you think about it, has about 40 million people. So 25% of all Californians live in one county, Los Angeles County. And here in Ventura County, right next door, we have less than 1 million. So COVID was interesting because there were three things that happened that kind of created this perfect storm. One was the fear of COVID itself, right? I mean, in the beginning, people were panicking. We were all going to die from COVID. That was a fear that people had, and they wanted to move out to the country to be in less densely populated areas. Number two was interest rates were incredibly low. They were historically low. I mean, residential rates were as low as 2.65, 2.7, just unheard of. Just an incredible opportunity for buyers to purchase with these great rates. And then the big kicker was when the boss said, hey, don't come to the office, work from home. So people in Los Angeles were like, wow, I can go to where it's less crowded. I can buy a house with these great rates, and I don't have to commute. I can work from the dining room table. So all of these things were, meshed together for a year and a half or longer. And so it created this perfect storm. So the concessions were almost flipped on their head. If folks recall, there really were no open houses happening for 2 years. One was, of course, COVID. You're not going to really have an open house with COVID surging. And the second thing was properties were just selling right away. I mean, there were 15 offers, 10 offers, 20 offers. It was just craziness. So the concessions were almost flipped on their head. It was basically the buyers giving the sellers a concession. Okay. And I would say that, offering above asking price in some ways is a concession, right? If you're out asking, $700,000 for your home and the buyer offers you $725,000, hey, that's a concession. Or a buyer says to a seller, I'll pay your closing costs. I don't want to, pay property taxes on that extra $25,000 forever. But I'm willing to pay your closing costs. If closing costs are $15,000, I'll give you a credit towards closing costs. So lots of tricks of the trade. But now, COVID is greatly diminished and the pandemic is pretty much, let's say, over or almost over.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're kind of, back to a normal situation where the sellers are essentially giving more concessions than the buyers would be giving. So the second category would be money. Okay. And rates, of course, have jumped up dramatically. They went up again this week. They're going to stay high for the foreseeable future. Gone are the days of 2.7, 3.5, 4% rates. We're now, in the high sixes, approaching 7, expected to go up again early 2023. So what can a seller do to encourage a buyer to purchase their home versus somebody else's home? And that's where concessions come in. Okay. On the monetary side, in addition to the repairs that we talked about, they can give money. Okay. And how do you do that? One is you can pay for a buyer's closing costs. Okay. Or a portion of the buyer's closing costs. That's money that the buyer does not have to pay out of pocket, which they have to pay out of pocket above and beyond the purchase price. Okay, there's escrow fees and closing costs and loan origination fees and those types of things. They can certainly do a price reduction. Okay, if they're asking 7, maybe they're willing to take an offer of 650 or 675. Okay, that you could put that into the category of concession. So money is, of course, always the big one.
Right.
And we talked about repairs. Maybe they're a little bit more generous than they would have been during COVID, right? Maybe the buyer's repair list is a little bit longer. And so the seller is a little bit more flexible with those repair items than they would have been, just even 8 months ago.
Wow. Have you had any extreme cases? Like anything like that just blew your mind for seller concessions?
Yes. So I would put probably my most extreme would be in the kind of personal property category, not in the money category or the repair category. And that was when the seller gave the buyer their dog.
What?
Yes. Now it might sound extreme. It is a little extreme, but of course there's always kind of backstory. This was a large, 20 plus acre ranch. It was a equestrian horse ranch. And the dog had grown up on this ranch. It never knew anything else other than living out in the country and really just kind of stayed around the property. He didn't run away. He wasn't really fenced in. And they knew that the seller knew that this dog was not going to really have a happy life if all of a sudden he was confined into a normal sized backyard, having grown up and lived on this, 20-acre property his whole entire life. So they knew that the best choice was to leave the dog with the property.
Wow.
And they weren't expecting that, but, the buyer asked. It's just kind of like the dog just kind of fit naturally into the environment. And so, it made sense. But that would probably be my most extreme. I have had transactions where, interestingly, the deal has almost fallen through over personal property.
Wow.
Typically in the farm properties, there's usually a tractor. And, sometimes that tractor has been, the child of the seller wants it, so it's not available. And sometimes, a buyer will purchase the tractor from the seller, but sometimes just to kind of close that gap, between what the seller is seeking price wise and what the buyer is offering, maybe just to close that gap, just to sweeten the deal, that tractor, comes into play, or, gators, quads, golf carts, tools, those types of things, personal property, could fall in the category of concession. if it's to kind of close the gap on price.
Nice. Wow, you've given us a lot of information about seller concessions, what they are, examples. But what is your advice for a seller in today's market?
Well, in today's market, I mean, again, the market has really shifted and continues to shift. I mean, I think it really is going to be a buyer's market in 2023. So, sellers should really think, what can they offer, up front to entice a buyer to, take a serious look at their property. Pricing, of course, is number one. Got to price your property correctly, or you're just going to be kind of fish out of water and, sitting there collecting dust. But what else can you offer to sweeten the deal? Is that paying for closing costs? Are there some cool personal items that you're willing to part with? What kind of repairs are you willing to take on? And then, at the end of the day, it really is going to be a challenge for sellers for the foreseeable future. So just, be flexible and, keep your eye on the big picture, right? If your goal really is to move, do what you need to do, but just kind of, realize that you're going to be flexible. Of course, you don't want to be taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want anybody to kind of pull the rug out from underneath you, but just kind of know going in that you're going to have to show flexibility to really make that deal happen. And then, buyers are going to be driving the train for a while. Sellers have been in charge for, almost 10 years, if not longer. And so it really is shifting. And I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities for buyers. I just negotiated a couple of transactions that were significantly below the asking price, challenging properties. These sellers did want to sell. And, these were cash buyers with very quick escrows. So that can be attractive to both parties, right?
Mm-hmm.
If a seller has a monthly mortgage and other costs related to taking care of a property, maybe taking a little bit less on the sale price is worth that quick close, because you no longer have that monthly expense hanging over your head for the next, several months or even longer.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul. That wraps up this episode of 15 Minutes with Paul Ward. Don't forget to subscribe and never miss a future episode. Paul's contact information is in the show notes. And if you have a suggestion for future episodes, we welcome those. Drop us an email. Also, if you have a few minutes, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It's totally free for you, and it goes a long way in helping people discover the podcast.
Thanks, Michaela.
Thank you.